Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Savita Pandey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome so many of you from around the world to our conversation on the role of technical assistance and capacity building in atrocity prevention. A special thanks goes to our co-host, the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations in Geneva, and to Deputy Permanent Representative Patricia Lynn McCullough for being here with us today and for delivering opening remarks. Today's conversation provides us with an important and much needed opportunity to unpack how the provision of technical assistance and capacity building can be important tools used by individual member states and the wider UN system in preventing atrocity crimes and deterring recurrence. While there is broad consensus on the importance and utility of technical cooperation for promoting and protecting human rights, today's discussion will focus on how such action can directly and intentionally address and alleviate risk factors that increase vulnerability to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, and in turn strengthen a country's national atrocity prevention architecture. The fact that multiple situations that are at risk of or experiencing atrocity crimes, such as in the DRC, South Sudan, or Venezuela, not only have robust investigative mechanisms in place, but are also addressed through a technical cooperation lens, further illustrates the importance of this conversation. Today, we want to identify how technical assistance is designed to address atrocity risk factors, what the gaps and challenges are in institutionalizing an atrocity prevention lens in technical cooperation, and how the wider UN system can further advance a holistic and cross-cutting approach to preventing atrocities and deter their recurrence, including through technical assistance and capacity building. I would like to raise a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website and YouTube channel. Throughout the event, please interact with us on Twitter. You can also interact with us through Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom link, and we may be able to take questions from the audience if time permits. It is now my great pleasure to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative and Minister Counselor of Canada to the United Nations in Geneva, Patricia Lynn McCullough. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Savita, and very nice to be here today, dear colleagues, friends. Good afternoon, bonjour. Thanks so much for joining today's discussion on strength. I guess I must say good afternoon and good morning, right? Realizing that we're also on the East Coast. So thanks for joining today's discussion on strengthening atrocity prevention through technical assistance and capacity building on the sidelines of the ongoing 52nd session of the Human Rights Council. On behalf of the Permanent Mission of Canada, I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation with esteemed experts and colleagues, some of whom you can see on your screen. I'd also very much like to thank the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect for co-hosting and coordinating today's event. Canada, as you may know, has been at the forefront of supporting and advancing both R2P and atrocity prevention, as well as technical cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the HRC and indeed beyond. As we know, at the heart of R2P lies the prevention of atrocity crimes. The UN human rights system, including its mechanisms and procedures, is particularly well suited to identify warning signs and risk factors for all countries at every stage of the prevention spectrum. The UPRs, special procedures, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the investigative mechanisms or treaty bodies, they all play a fundamental role in drawing attention to gaps and challenges in a country's national prevention architecture and how to close protection gaps for structural and proximate prevention of escalation. So in this regard, technical assistance and capacity building can be particularly useful measures available to individual member states and the wider international community to build national capacities to combat human rights violations and abuses, and therefore the commission of atrocity crimes in line with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of the R2P. So at the HRC 52 alone, member states will discuss existing technical cooperation for a number of situations at risk. Of those experiencing or emerging from atrocity crimes, including, and Savita, you already mentioned some, DRC, Mali, Ukraine, Central African Republic, CAR, South Sudan, Libya, etc. So as we embark on this final week of this session, multiple resolutions also continue to be negotiated to continue this vital work around the world. Yet while there is a strong understanding of the key role that technical assistance and capacity building may play in preventing escalation or the recurrence of atrocity crimes, including a role for OHCHR's Emergency Response Team initiative, which is strengthening UN regional capacity for early warning and information management with a view to support the UN country teams on risk mitigation. A systematic inclusion of the atrocity prevention lens in technical cooperation has yet to be achieved. So today, with the invited esteemed experts in the field of technical assistance, we hope that you'll better understand how we can systematically use technical cooperation to address and respond to and mitigate risk factors of atrocity crimes, uphold our individual and joint responsibility to protect, and contribute to a more holistic prevention and response measures at the HRC and beyond. Canada's really proud to be able to facilitate this discussion today. For me to give opening remarks is a true pleasure, and we really look forward to hearing all of you distinguished panelists. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Merci beaucoup et bonne session. Have a good session. Thank you so much. I think you're muted, Savita.
Sorry about that. I said we are still figuring it out after 3 years into the Zoom world, but thank you so much for your opening remark. It's also always a pleasure for us to co-host events with the Permanent Mission of Canada in Geneva. So now a very warm welcome to our panelists. And before we jump into the question answer session, I would briefly like to introduce our very distinguished panel. We have Georgette Guégan, who's the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Libya, Mika Canerva-Wori, who's OHCHR representative in Guatemala, Christian Salazar-Wokman, Director of Field Operations and Technical Cooperation, OHCHR, and Isha Daifan, Independent Expert on the Situation of Human Rights in Somalia. It is a pleasure to have all of you with us. And as you know, that this is a question answer session, so I will start by directing my first question to Christian. Christian, how are technical assistance and capacity building provided by OHCHR designed for countries experiencing or emerging from atrocity crimes? And does this process differ at all when developing assistance for human rights crises without serious atrocity risks?
Well, thank you, Savita. Thanks very much for having me here, dear colleagues, participants. Maybe also to start by thanking Canada, for its really long-standing commitments, very consistent on the international protection agenda. I think we really, really treasure this and all the support given to OHCHR and the different parts of the human rights system. It's not often that we see such a long-term consistent support to a very complex agenda. So I just wanted to say that up front. You're putting big questions here, so I try to be really brief because colleagues will talk a lot about the experience, which is what matters. But for every technical assistance, context matters. So the first thing I have to say, it is important to develop the technical assistance in situations as you described, also with a country lead in a broad way. The people in the country should lead this process. We have provided assistance in a number of issues that are well known, I think, to everybody: transitional justice, security sector reform, judicial processes, building up national human rights institutions, protection programs for survivors, but then also mere awareness raising and training on international human rights and international human rights law standards and education. I think in all of this, methodologically speaking, for us, it is very important that the technical assistance in this field, in these situations, is closely linked to the human rights monitoring that we and other players are undertaking, and that it is coupled up with very strong national international advocacy. The biggest challenge in all of this, if I may say, has to do with accountability. If we address accountability in amongst the many areas that come to bear for technical assistance, because in countries that emerge from gross violation of human rights, you usually face lots of resistance to advance with accountability, not just criminal accountability, truth-telling, remedy, reparations, non-repetition. So I guess one thing that is a bit more special, we don't do this distinction as you do so much, but is that technical cooperation linked to situations of grave human rights violations needs to be linked to a political process, whether it's often linked, negotiated with a national process or an international process. For example, a number of initiatives in technical cooperation in such countries are linked either to a Security Council or a Human Rights Council mandate. For example, many are linked to peace negotiations and something that the parties agree that has to happen in terms of accountability or transitional justice. And so what we need maybe more than in any other type of situations is strong political actors to back up the technical work, because in the end, it needs to be linked to a political process, because the resistance often is so strong. Many of those responsible are still in power or have influence. So that's a little bit, they fear basically go to jail or something. Finally, I promise to be brief. Finally, I think one thing I would like to mention is that situations of conflict and gross violations are often linked to significant poverty, inequality, and marginalization. And hence it is important as part of the package, I would say, of prevention and addressing even aftermaths of massive violations, to invest into the capacity of states to deliver basic social services, to the whole population, but also to those affected rural, far away communities, so that people really feel the dividend of peace. And that's why, that's my last word to your question. On one side, I describe the transitional justice, the accountability, everything that we do, but it is important that this being linked to investment into Agenda 2030 and sustainable development. And I'm not saying this to be politically correct, but we know from so many situations that the war, the weapons were put down, some truth-telling happened, but the situation of the population has not, the root causes have not significantly changed. So we should always look at these social areas, the social development, the famous nexus, together with what I just described at the beginning. Thank you, and back to you.
No, thank you so much for that, Christian. And I really appreciate you bringing in the 2030 agenda, because peace that is not inclusive, that is not just, that doesn't bring everyone together, in the end, doesn't pay the same kind of peace dividends as the peace which has an accountability and a transitional justice element attached to it. So that's a very, very important point. And I think that you say bringing in 2030 is not polite. It's just, it's truly sort of at the heart of thinking about not leaving anybody behind in most of these situations. So the next question now is to Georgette. Georgette, based on your extensive experience with technical cooperation, where do you see the gaps, challenges, and opportunities for tailoring technical cooperation to address situations at risk of or experiencing atrocity crimes?
Yeah, thank you. Let me make a few points. Thanks very much to the opportunity. Thanks to Canada. And of course, so nice to see so many of my colleagues, my former colleagues online and as part of this panel. So I would say two things. I think technical cooperation provides the opportunity to engage with authorities, of course, and engage at common ground to address root causes of gross human rights violations. And you could call that both prevention and protection, although more protection, and to some extent accountability. And of course, by providing technical support and exchanging comparative experiences and best practices, we as the UN can collaborate with national authorities, or at least try to work with them to the extent possible to foster institutional reform, try and push accountability and pursue justice, of course, all needed to, again, try and push guarantees of non-reoccurrence, which could be prevention. So I wanted to speak about a second element of technical cooperation in my experience, which is really atrocity prevention. And colleagues will know well our very good example of efforts to really protect civilians and prevent civilian casualties in Afghanistan in particular, and now, of course, in many other countries. And in Afghanistan, which I think colleagues wanted me to really highlight this example, and this was a few years ago, although the system is still working. We put in place, and this was the UNAMA Human Rights Service, so the human rights component of the Special Political Mission in Afghanistan, we put in place what's called a civilian casualty documentation, reporting, and advocacy mechanism. And this became a core element of a real effort to prevent war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other types of violence against civilians by all parties to the conflict at that point. And this was a very deliberate effort of tracking documentation, as I said, production over the time I was there of at least 30 reports on civilian casualties, and with recommendations to all parties to really mitigate the civilian harm. And these reports, based on our monitoring, which was done across the country, and as I said, was very authoritative and accurate data, very well sourced. It provided authoritative real-time information about casualties and protection concerns. And we really documented all parties' compliance, of course, with IHL. And these findings and public reports allowed the mission and the human rights team and many other actors, civil society, to engage in targeted advocacy with Afghan and international forces, and of course the Taliban, on tactics, protection trends, specific cases, emerging risks, and most importantly, prevention. Now, let me just call it, and of course we had a number of results on that. For example, Afghan and international military forces changed their tactics on air and night raid search operations and ERW to put protection of civilians at the core, which resulted in decreased civilian casualties by these forces. So one could say there that is atrocity prevention. And the Taliban's messaging at that point in time increasingly stressed protection of civilians, with some changes observed in their targeting. But why was this, to some extent, technical cooperation? You might be asking that. It was technical cooperation because we worked very diligently with the Afghan government, the international forces, to have themselves, their own forces, put in place civilian casualty tracking mechanisms, which they did. So this is really what we wanted to do, and we provided this through technical cooperation, working closely with them on the methods that we were using to track civilian casualties, and of course, follow up. If there's an event, if there's an incident, how is it followed up? Where is the accountability? So I wanted to highlight that. And of course, there's much more to say about that particular example, which is now, as I said, being used most well at the moment by the OHCHR team in Ukraine, which, as you know, is very actively tracking protection of civilian issues in the Ukraine. And then just briefly on Libya, and I'll say more about Libya in the next round, is one example there. We've done quite a lot of technical cooperation, and this is again through the human rights component of the Special Political Mission, UNSMIL, in Libya. What we've done there is we recently convened a High Libyan Committee on Arbitrary Detention, which includes 15 senior Libyan officials from, of course, defense, justice, police, military, prosecution, internal security, to really discuss how to reduce and address arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances through changes to legislation, a national coordination mechanism, and a number of other technical coordination type processes. So perhaps I'll leave it there for now, but thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.
No, thank you, Georgette. I mean, those are really concrete examples and sort of give us a glimpse of the sort of the length and breadth of what OHCHR and the UN does in terms of building capacity of member states and local authorities in protecting populations. So thank you so much for that. Now on to Mika. Mika, could you share with us how technical cooperation between OHCHR and the government of Guatemala aims to address the country's history of atrocity crimes? To what extent do ongoing capacity building measures focus on elevating structural and institutional risk factors that have facilitated past violence?
Thank you very much, and good morning from Guatemala. Good to see colleagues, and thank you to the organizers. Happy to be part of this event, important event. And indeed, capacity building and technical assistance, in my view, is as important as the monitoring and investigation work. And of course, in all countries and in all circumstances, it's the country context that will basically decide what track is potentially the more effective one or have an impact. And that's exactly the case in Guatemala. There is no doubt that capacity development strengthens also the prevention side, and not only capacity development, but also technical assistance in developing and implementing policies. And for example, Guatemala still is 25 years after the internal armed conflict, is part of the peace building fund activities, for example, which is a great opportunity for technical cooperation and technical assistance, but also developing of legal frameworks and human rights training for law enforcement and military personnel, and also to the National Human Rights Institution to actually push forward a bit the agendas. Now, in the context of Guatemala and the political context at the moment, there is very little political will within the government to work towards accountability. And also there is actually a fading interest or attention also from the international community as a whole. But in that context, the office here since years have actually, in terms of looking at the 5 pillars of transitional justice, we are in the sense of seeking accountability and the responsibility. We are actually much more in the monitoring of the few processes that are ongoing. And that's the good news, that there are a few processes ongoing, and we do have, in the context of Guatemala, we have some emblematic cases over the last year as well. But our work has actually been concentrating on first of all, preservation and access to the state archives, which finally have been opened and have been systematized. And now the big challenge is what to do with the archives when they are actually open, and not just having it as the memory part and the museum of what happened, but actually actively using those. And that's what we are working on. We're also strengthening the capacities of prosecutors, and especially those who are working in the territories, not necessarily in the capital only, in helping them to investigate and actually prosecute based on international standards. And the same we do with the judicial officials. So basically training them to understand the dimensions and the international standards in relation to prosecution of crime proceedings and the issues related to the conflict. Now, that's the side of state institutions. As I said, there is very little interest in the actual government to move forward. So we have chosen to also do the capacity building with victims organizations, and that's actually it's a very important part to keep in mind, the support to those who are actually seeking the justice side. And also we have started to work with the university students and civil society organizations, both in terms of the archives, access to the archives and using the archives, but also having events and activities that reinitiates the memory, because that is a big risk that in country contexts like here, they want to change the narrative a bit about the past. Now, in terms of, I think what Christian was saying is very important, to actually look at the whole package, and in Guatemala in particular, the agrarian structure, the economic exclusion, racism, subordination, and exclusion of indigenous peoples, the history of dictatorship and authoritarianism, etc., are very present still in the country. And that's something that one has to actually work on parallel to seeking justice through transitional justice processes. I mean, there has been, first of all, it is a long-term commitment that one has to think about. I mean, we had the conflict ended in 1996, and there's been a number of processes, including with support of the international community. And we have reached basically 4 or 5 emblematic cases in the last 25 years, which is very low as a success rate. The hope we are putting at the moment is in the national reparation program. And that's something that the office is, through capacity building, supporting very much. The authorities involved or in charge of the reparation program doesn't necessarily have the capacity and the understanding. And that's where we have an added value from our side to actually push forward the agenda. And as I said, the monitoring of the few processes that are ongoing is of importance. And that is the base for the technical cooperation that we are actually doing. But I leave it there for now, and then we'll retake a few issues in the next round. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mika, that is really rich in terms of sort of the length and breadth of what the UN is trying to do. And it's really interesting that when you see that there is sort of a lack of political will to engage in these processes from the state, you have changed tracks and are thinking in terms of the victim and survivor groups, and also thinking in terms of how we can sort of maintain the memory, because a generation is passing and new generations are coming in, which might buy into narratives that are not exactly conducive to transitional justice processes. So it's really interesting that how you're changing tracks and using all sort of different stakeholders to move the process along. So thank you so much for that. Isha, now on to you. Your mandate includes providing recommendations on technical assistance in the field of human rights. How are you interpreting this mandate in light of Somalia's recent history of war crimes and crimes against humanity and the high risk of recurrence? And what type of assistance would you recommend to Somalia to address atrocity risk factors?
Thank you very much, Kavita, and welcome to all my former colleagues again. And thank you to Canada for the continuing work on this topic. I'm delighted to be here to share some of my own experiences, particularly now as independent expert for Somalia. So I may be referring to Somalia a lot in answering my questions. So let me start by giving you a sense of the current situation in Somalia, because I think that captures the risk factors that we have and why we can say that the situation in Somalia really covers all of the 14 risk factors of the UN. Just recently, the Secretary General's report in February stated as follows. The report says that Somalia's recorded 1,059 civilian casualties, of which 300, sorry, let me just put that off. Apologies. Apologies. The number of casualties recorded in the last quarter, which they reported in February, was 1,059 civilian casualties, of which 382 were killed and 677 were injured, a 153% increase from figures recorded in the last quarter. Really, really high. Of this report, Al-Shabaab remains the main perpetrators, responsible for 841 civilian casualties, followed by 100 attributed to state institutions and state forces, and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make here is that the report goes on to say that Al-Shabaab committed more mass casualty attacks using improvised explosive devices. And one of those attacks by Al-Shabaab occurred at the Zubi junction, which your organization also has reported on in Mogadishu last year in October. The report calls 2022 the deadliest year since 2017. It paints a picture of why Somalia is important. Also recently, you may also have heard about the incident in Laksanud in the Sol district between Somaliland security forces and clan militias. That left at least 49 civilians dead and about 90 injured between December 2022 and February 2023. That's the context that we're talking about. And that's why it's critical to look at this topic against what's happening in Somalia. Given those levels of human rights violations, it is my view that nearly all of the 14 UN risk factors for atrocity crimes are present in my context in Somalia. And most of those, of course, are against crimes against humanity committed by state and non-state actors. So I therefore interpret my mandate to provide recommendations on technical assistance in the field of human rights on the item 10 of the agenda of the Human Rights Council. As it requires me to work with Somali's authorities. I cannot escape that. But also with national and international partners through international cooperation to support the prevention of atrocity crimes by building Somalia's institutional capacity, as well as regional and sub-regional organizations that support Somalia in addressing the security situation. And I'm talking here about the IGAD Association in East Africa, and the AU, who have a huge amount of security forces supporting the Somali government. I also advocate on working with civil society organizations to strengthen prevention, early warning, and response capacity put forward by the government. The type of assistance I would recommend, and I have already recommended, can be seen in my 2021 report. In that report, I proposed 7 benchmarks with 7 and 8 indicators of each benchmark, and they cover all the areas of security, accountability, economics and social cultural rights issues, media, equality, gender equality issues, and looking at special groups. The idea of the benchmarks and the indicators was to, for the first time, introduce measures that I believe would be able to measure progress in building state institutions and strengthening civil society groups, and then be able to propose to the Human Rights Council outstanding areas where Somalia is not making progress. Now, we have to remember that the mandate has been going on for 25 years. And Somalia is very conscious of the fact that it's been long-standing. And therefore, it is critical for me to be able to work very closely with them. They initially made significant progress in building institutions, and then they fell back. And therefore, it has been very important for us to ensure that the international community is engaged in capacity building and that the government itself is responding. We have been lucky in the last year that the incoming government, which came into operation last June, is very conscious of the human rights situation and has expressed itself in terms of meeting its commitments on human rights, and to look at the recommendations that I've made in my report, as well as to follow through with the recommendations that they have accepted from other human rights proposals. I am therefore confident that going forward, we will be able to address some of the prevention measures that will be put in place. I have to mention here that the increase in human rights violations in the last quarter or so may well have resulted from the posture taken by the government in addressing Al-Shabaab. And therefore, Somalia, unlike so many of the other conflict situation, is in a different place in terms of the mix between the clan conflict as well as the conflict relating to Al-Shabaab. And so the approach that is used to address prevention of atrocity crimes, from my perspective in terms of my proposals in the 2021 report, as well as other efforts by member states coming together, has made some progress. For example, the mutual accountability framework by international donors is one other attempt by the international community to provide Somalia with the support it needs to build its political as well as economic institutions. And they have done a lot of work on building economic institutions to respond to issues of economic, social, and cultural rights. And we're hoping that with my proposals on human rights and the work of the mutual accountability program by donors, we would accelerate human rights capacity building to advance on building institutions that will make a difference in the life of civilians in Somalia. So let me stop there and get back to you, Kavita.
No, absolutely, Isha. No, thank you for some those very important thoughts on how we can make progress in Somalia. My next question goes to Georgette. Georgette, to what extent, if at all, does analysis conducted by special procedures, investigative mechanisms, or human rights component of peacekeeping missions feed into technical assistance and capacity building? How can we further strengthen these linkages to ensure a more holistic and complementary approach by the UN human rights system to address atrocity risks and protection gaps? I think you alluded a little bit on this in your previous answer, but if you could just elaborate a little bit more in the context.
Sure. First, let me just say what my colleague Isha Daifan said about the protection of civilian issues when she highlighted all the stats and the data and the atrocity risk factors. That's another example of what I spoke about in my intervention and what we had done as the human rights team in Afghanistan and in many other countries, OHCHR teams and the missions. So and a very important component of tool of atrocity prevention. Well, let me just say that obviously investigations into human rights violations and technical cooperation are totally, in our experience, I think, mutually reinforcing and very much part of a continuing and deep effort to address atrocities and atrocity prevention. And let me just say today, we have a very good example of that. Right now, the fact-finding mission on Libya is presenting its final report before the Human Rights Council. And I'm just reading, because they're speaking now, as I understand, or they spoke this morning, that their main recommendation as in their last report is that they call on Libyan authorities to develop a human rights plan of action and a comprehensive victim-centered roadmap on transitional justice without delay. So what will happen is that there will be a program, as I understand it, of some technical cooperation, a number of very discrete activities, which the human rights component of UNSMIL will, together with Libyan authorities, take forward. So this really is a fact-finding mission, a mechanism out of the Human Rights Council that is then being taken forward into technical cooperation. And of course, this whole area of work on Libya was done under item 10, at least this element of it, as I understand. So that will go forward, and OHCHR and the UN supports that through budgeting and other means. Those are very important. And there is a similar type effort there was for the DRC, following a fact-finding mission there, and a number of commissions of inquiry and other colleagues online know more about that. And then let me just highlight one area which Christian mentioned, and I wanted to follow up. In Libya, we also have put in place, as do all UN country teams, in every country where there is a UN country team, we need to put in place a UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, which is taking forward a set of national priorities with government, based on government priorities with government. This is a common document to do the SDGs and take forward Agenda 2030. In our cooperation framework in Libya, we have a whole pillar of 4 pillars on peace and security. And in that pillar is a number of very clear kind of technical cooperation elements. One is on national reconciliation, one is on security sector reform, one is on DDR, and a couple of other, regular human rights monitoring. So you can also use kind of the development part of the work to take forward technical cooperation within this type of cooperation framework. Every UN agency in the country, including OHCHR, signs up and is part of the cooperation framework. So it's quite a useful tool to take forward some technical cooperation. And I think I answered the question, but maybe we can pass on also to other colleagues. Thank you.
No, thank you, Georgette, for that. And I mean, both Isha and you emphasized the sort of centering human rights and centering accountability, and also 2030 agenda in how we are thinking about technical assistance. Because if we don't center these issues very systematically into political process, or what happens as we go forward, then the successes will not be as sustainable and will not give us the guarantees of adherence. So Isha, I'll just come back to you very quickly. I'm conscious of the time. We are at 9:47 and we have 3 more questions for our panelists. So Isha, very quickly, if you could also sort of highlight the limitations, and I think that both of you have spoken, Georgette, and I think that each one of you has sort of alluded to this, but what are the limitations of pursuing a technical assistance mandate for situations where atrocity crimes are ongoing? In addition to technical assistance, what are the other factors that are so important in taking this agenda forward?
Thank you very much, Kavita. I wonder whether I should just start by saying maybe there shouldn't be any limitations, but I won't because I want to explain. If I take the situation of Somalia, as I have mentioned, some of the specificities of the conflict situation, and the efforts that have gone in the last 25 years in trying to address a very complex situation, in my view. Let me start by saying what those efforts are, because I think it makes sense to see whether there are limitations or not. Because right from the start, I think there were 3 dimensions of the approach that had been used, and they're very different situations from, let's say, South Sudan or Venezuela. And the first one is the efforts by the UN and the AU in establishing the missions, with very robust mandates in terms of addressing the conflict situations. And then, of course, you had the support of the US in terms of AFRICOM, trying to also boost, responses and that work. You could analyze those 2 by saying they were not perfect, but that they advanced the situation in terms of supporting the government to respond to state and non-state actors who were committing human rights violations that touch and concern atrocity crimes. And then this time round, the new government also has taken this posture of actually being on the offensive with its own military. So all of those have had mixed reviews and results. Nevertheless, they are from the context of item 10, and they are from the context of capacity building institutions, focusing on security, of course, but also looking across the board on accountability and looking at how to build a resilient society. And that's why I had proposed that we will have to look at economic, social, and cultural rights in order to have a transition and a sustainability after the conflict situation has been addressed. I would not think that there should be a limitation. What I would suggest, therefore, is that when we look at these very complex situations, there should always be a consideration of looking at prevention of atrocity crimes right from the beginning. When you are at the item 10 stage in a country that has had scrutiny for the last 25 years, it's far more difficult, even if there is a pushback or a loss of momentum, to be able to introduce some of these measures that I believe could work, because of the political dynamics in country and new and emerging issues in the global scene, as we have seen. So my work of both monitoring the implementation of my 7 benchmarks, as well as advocacy with the international community to support the investment that they've already made on Somalia, are important. And so I would put my efforts into that, rather where I believe that there may well be some successes, rather than introducing resolutions that the governments and others might take as, pulling back away from Somalia. So that would be my situation, and that's not to say that what in the statistics I read are not serious. They're extremely serious. But at this level in Somalia, the state institutions and accountability are still very weak, and it would have been a good idea to have introduced the proposals that maybe Yasmin made in South Sudan, to be able to really make progress. But I'm not sure that, given that states really believe that when you introduce item 10, they're at the end of their process, and that they should be really lifting, the scrutiny a little bit. Unfortunately, Somalia is not there yet. None of the human rights institutions have fully been completed in terms of establishment. And so those may be the limitations in this particular case, but my commitment would be that to introduce further scrutiny and examples of where you can really collect and investigate all of the crimes, so that you are able in the future to be able to pursue them.
No, thank you for that, Isha. That's really powerful and important. I'm very conscious of running out of time, so very quickly to both Mika and Christian. Mika, you alluded in your previous response that how, within Guatemala, the lack of sort of political will and within the government is impacting how you're able to deliver on technical assistance and capacity building. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on that, and also to sort of wrap up, give us concrete examples of, within those limitations, how are you thinking in terms of non-recurrence in Guatemala?
Thank you, $1 million question. Listen, from the country perspective, and I do recognize and appreciate the whole issue of Human Rights Council and the international community. That is extremely important to actually put that pressure, because the first thing of success at the country level is that there is committed leadership. A leadership with clear vision for change, mobilize the necessary resources, and build a consensus around how to move forward. And yes, sometimes it is required that the agenda be discussed at the Human Rights Council level or even the Security Council, but the international community involvement in that is extremely important. Another element that actually works very well is to continuously do a needs assessment, and look at the specific needs and the challenges faced by the institution at the moment. Not just stay in the peace agreement is of importance, no doubt, but the circumstances changes over the years. So continuously doing a needs assessment is working, and based on the needs assessment, doing a tailored approach. And that might change over the years, and we can't just think stagnated in one size doesn't fit all, and circumstances changes. So that's an important element, and also the fact that thinking sustainability. So yes, it is a long-term commitment. You have to get the long-term commitment from the authorities, but also the commitment from the actors, not only OICHR, but also other actors in the country, to actually continuously trying to move forward. And yes, there are ups and downs in that process, and one has to look at it from that side. Protection, I think, is very important. Protection of the officials who are actually trying to work, I mean, in the judiciary or in the Attorney General's office, the prosecution side. Protection of those officials is of importance because they are under pressure and they are getting attacks. And also the victims and their lawyers, because in the context of Guatemala, the actual victim and perpetrator still lives in the same community. So there is a more holistic view needed, and the constant monitoring and evaluation of where are we going, what are we actually trying to achieve, how do we actually achieve that, and where how to move forward. And as I was saying earlier, not necessarily all countries and circumstances have the same buy-in, political buy-in from the government side. So work with various actors in the country, including various civil society actors, international, regional, or national actors. I would say that as a short summary and conclusion from my part is what I want to put forward. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Mika, for that. And I mean, I'm really glad that you emphasized sort of the multiplicity of stakeholders involved in how we approach accountability and how we think about technical assistance and capacity building. It's not just targeting recommendations at the state, because state is also, so many different kinds of stakeholders. And Christian, coming back to you, I mean, you're sitting in Geneva and sort of looking at various technical assistance and capacity building projects that OHCHR is involved in. So just your final thoughts in terms of some lessons learned in terms of how you cooperate with governments in providing technical assistance and capacity building, which has real impact on the ground and is sustainable. So just some final thoughts in how you're thinking in terms of some good practices and recommendations.
Well, thanks very much, and I'll keep it short given the time also. I mean, the first thing just to say is how important it is to invest into early warning and risk analysis. And I think Patricia mentioned this at the beginning, to have good data trend analysis available and good deep root cause analysis. That goes a long way in planning of whatever you do in human rights and prevention of atrocities. We have now 7, we call emergency response teams in 7 regions that do this ongoing horizon scanning and risk identification. So it's possible to do this and important. Maybe a second thing is, Isha alluded to this, is the societies we work in with this type of cooperation, there is very little money and very weak capacity. So it needs really a sustained international support working in this field. You need national ownership, but you need that international support in these days of age. This support is difficult, getting more difficult. So maybe that's the second thing, because this is an area we need international financial support to move forward. Maybe a third lesson is to recognize that we are currently operating worldwide in a situation of reducing or closing civic space in many, many countries. And taking that into account for the topic we're looking at, just to underline once more the importance to develop technical cooperation with, for, and through NGOs, through the victims' organization, the human rights defenders, and others, given that the space is closing in many countries. And in addition to that, Mika mentioned, that space is closing also, meaning human rights defenders, judicial operators, journalists, lawyers get more and more under pressure, under threat, etc. So we see also that we need to look into innovative ways of national but also international protection for those actors that engage with these processes, which are, as I mentioned before, as we know, dangerous processes. There's a lot of resistance. So people who move there, really, we need to support them. And maybe finally, there's an interesting newer trend I don't trend, but there's some interesting new developments on the financial side of atrocities and the commitment of large human rights atrocities. The economic side of that. I mean, the Commission of Inquiry of South Sudan issued a study on corruption and oil revenues. Our colleagues in Myanmar just did a financial analysis of this financial structure that supports the Tatmadaw. And I just wanted to bring this in because before I was looking about scarce resources. There are people that make money out of gross human rights violations. And I think a trend or a lesson is that we need to look more into these economic and financial structures that sustain and support gross human rights violations. Much to say, but I leave it at that.
No, thank you so much, Christian. I think that you ended us at the perfect point with some sort of very big picture recommendations, which are very important to think about if you're thinking about prevention of atrocity crimes, recurrence, and also transformation of conflict situations. So I know we have run out of time, but we have such an amazing group of experts with us. So I'll just beg for your time in terms of just the next 5 minutes. If Mika, Georgette, Isha, Christian, you have just some final words to say at the end, it'll be great to hear from you. Georgette, please go ahead.
No, I wanted to really reinforce what Christian and the others had said about civil society. And this was going to be my final comment as well, that really a key recommendation is for us to really be working as much as we can with different civil society actors, providing them with the protection they need. In many cases, and certainly, for example, in Libya, and of course in other countries, the space is really, really, really restricting. And we have huge hate speech problems and other types of concerns with civil society, very restrictive laws. So I would really highlight that as a key recommendation for taking forward, atrocity prevention protection. Just making that point, really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgette. Isha, would you like to say something?
Yes, very much so. I want to make 3 points. One has already been made by Mika, which is it is critical in the country that you're working on to think about the context, because indeed, it is not every proposal that will be suitable for your country. So you have to understand what's going on and be able to look at the political, the religious, and the traditional avenues to be able to make proposals that you think will work at the end of the day, and not make them blindly. The second is that you have to be innovative. There's no way you can just make proposals theoretically. And I say this because in the last couple of years, proposals on legislations have failed in the parliament in Somalia due to the fact that we have not done an analysis and a mapping of the situation on the ground, and to be able to propose innovative ways to address sexual violence in conflict situations. And recently, from an experience in Mali, I was able to find out how just issuing a fatwa from the religious groups addressed a situation that had been ongoing for more than 5 years. Yet with one fatwa, they were able to stop, at least address some of the elements of sexual violence. So being innovative, understanding your context is critical. And to broaden our proposals beyond just looking at our traditional human rights frameworks, but to go beyond that and to see how you can bring development into it has been, for me, very useful, especially with climate change affecting Somalia so much now. So those are the 3 things that I would propose when making my proposal on addressing atrocity crimes.
No, Isha, that is fantastic. Mika, Christian, any last words? Mika, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. No, very much echoing what colleagues have already said, and work closely with civil society actors and other stakeholders in the country context is crucial. The other thing is I go back to the needs assessment and again what Aisha was saying as well. The context is extremely important, and for that, when we are in the country, of course, it's much easier for us as well to actually bring about those circumstances, and that will be that's the challenge when you don't have a presence or very strong presence of actors in countries. And the last one, the prevention lens in everything that we are doing and putting it a bit like a not mainstreaming as such, but bringing it into a number of things that we are actually trying to do and linking them together. That's the way forward. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for that, Mika. Christian.
No, I mean, I think it was really a good session. I can only say, I mean, this is what Isha mentioned, the innovation. I think we do need innovation in protection matters in a wide sense of the word. Georgette mentioned hate speech. I should have mentioned that also, because we see there's a social media side to atrocities and crime. It's a macro crime, and I think that we need to look much more systematically. The other thing, coming back to the protection, we see really more and more people in need for protection, and the systems right now are just overstretched or overburdened. And if people who have courage and who are usually very good professionals in their area, the lawyers, the judicial operators, the civil society activists, many, they have to leave their country, and then they end up doing nothing or something which really hasn't a lot to do with their professional know-how. And I think we need to find dignified ways of protection so that that know-how of those people in country or outside country can be still harvested and they can continue to contribute. That's what I could say, but much more to say, actually. It's a big topic.
No, thank you very much. And thank you very much for taking the time to compress so much learning and experience and practice that each one of you has done over the years, and then compressing them in an hour with 15 minutes each for all of you. But that was fantastic, and I think that sort of the big themes are about protection of human rights defenders, people on the front lines. I think transformation is a whole of society approach. And Christian, coming back to your point with the international community, that these processes are not something which is done in 6 months or a year. We require long-term sustainable capacity building and technical assistance, because if we don't have that, then we really cannot prevent or provide guarantees for recurrence. So thank you once more for your fantastic participation. And this was such a fantastic event that we really want to sort of come back and explore this more through various ways. So thank you again, and thank you for all those who have joined us online for this fantastic event. And again, a big thank you to the Permanent Mission of Canada in Geneva. Without your support, these kinds of discussions are not possible. So we thank you for making this happening. And for anybody who has missed the event or would like to see it again, to learn from it, the recording will be available on the Global Center website. With that, I thank you again and have a fantastic day or an evening. Bye-bye.